So welcome to the story wheel. As the wheel turns once more, and it is Beltane, nearly Beltane in the southern hemisphere. And very different from what's going on in the northern hemisphere where it's nearly Samhain, both magical times when the veil is at its thinnest. But at Beltane, we're not only open to communications with the spirits of the dead, we're noticing the shifts in the energies of rebirth, of growth and of green, of the green man and the green woman, the combining of the masculine and the feminine to create the next generation of whatever it might be. Something more, something healthy growth so that there is a continuation of that which sustains and provides. Growth that knows its place as the wheel turns, eventually taking us back to the times of the harvest and then to inevitable death and decay. So, this time I'm going to share a story that's a little bit dark in parts, even though it is a story for Beltane. It's a tale of birth and of rebirth and of rebirth. It's the tale of the elements, a tale of cycles, and in a way, it could be seen as a tale of reincarnation. It's a Welsh tale, the tale of Cerridwen and the cauldron of inspiration and the birth of Taliesin. And it's known so well. There are many different ways of telling it, but this is how we're going to tell it today. So long, long ago, back in the days of King Arthur, no less, there lived a woman and her husband, and in many ways they were quite an ordinary couple, except that, well, he was a giant, and she was, well, some people said she was a goddess, and some people said she was a witch, and some people said she was just a woman, as so many women are. And this couple lived on the shores of a magical lake in North Wales called Clyn Tegid. And now, although this woman's husband was a giant, his importance in our story is teeny weeny, except that this woman called Cerridwen and this giant of a man had had 2 children together. And one of these children was a girl, and she was beautiful. She would always have the whole world at her feet. She was wise and gracious, gentle and kind, a bit insipid if truth be known, but she was perfect, really. Because she was perfect, she too has a tiny little part to play in our story. No, who we are interested in is the son, Morvan, whose name meant sea cow. However, this poor child was as ugly as the girl was beautiful, and he was thick, and he was stubborn and crude and rude and thoroughly nasty. And in fact, he had so little to recommend him to the world that his parents took to calling him a vugddi. And if you thought sea cow was a bad translation, a vugddi means utter darkness. And indeed, Cerridwen could see no future at all for this hideous child, but it did tear at her mother's heart. In fact, so much that she swore that she would have to do something to ensure that he would have a place in the world. And if he couldn't have looks and grace, well, she would have to give him wisdom. Wisdom and knowledge. In fact, all of the wisdom and the knowledge that there ever was, is now, and will ever be. Yes, she thought, this son of mine is going to stride through the world as the greatest of bards, the greatest oracle, the greatest of all intellects. There will be nothing he does not know or can do, and he will become legendary. I wonder how this is going to go. And so, gathering all of her wisdom from her years of being the witch and the goddess and the wise woman, or just the woman, Cerridwen set about a plan which involved her cauldron and water from the magical Llyntegid. And this plan involved herbs and roots and fungi and all manner of provisions from great Mother Nature. And this plan involved gathering and sorting and preparing all of these things at just the right time of year. At the full moon, or the new moon, or the solstice, or the equinox. In fact, this plan involved creating an elixir that would take a year and a day to prepare. From Beltane Eve to the following year. Not only that, the elixir had to simmer, not boil, and not sit unstirred. Not be left alone for one moment of that whole year and a day. And even more, once the elixir was ready, it would only be the first 3 drops that would contain Arwen. Arwen, the inspiration and creative power that Avagdhi would need to transform him into the wisest of all men. And whatever remained in the cauldron after those 3 drops, well, that would be bitter, bitter poison. And it would mean death to whoever had it. Oh, and so Cerridwen recognised, okay, a year and a day. She was going to need some help. And so she went to a nearby village and she called upon the old blind man whose every other sense was highly attuned, and his boy Gwion Bark, whose job it was to lead the old blind man about. And to them Cerridwen said, come and work for me for a year and a day. I will give you a roof over your head and good food to eat, and I will pay you well if only you do exactly as I say. You, old man, you will stir the potion I'm making in my cauldron for that year and a day without ceasing. And you, boy, you will gather twigs and sticks, and your job will be to keep that fire at just the right temperature to keep the potion simmering. And they agreed. And so it was. Cerridwen installed them in her cottage, and she set about filling the cauldron with water and gathering the herbs and the roots and the plants, everything she needed, and she settled herself into a year of minding the movements of the stars and the temperature of the earth and the tides and the cycles of growth for each special ingredient. While the old man, well, he set to stirring and sniffing and listening. When it boiled too much, he would adjust his stirring so the potion settled. And Gwion Bark, well, he did his job admirably, running to the forest for kindling and stoking the fire to just the right level to keep the heat from dying away. And this year and a day went on. It started from Beltane Eve and it ended at Beltane, when the full force of this elixir would be there and the veil was at its thinnest. So Beltane, everyone was excited, everyone was exhausted, and everyone thought they knew what was going to happen. But actually, no one guessed what was about to happen. At Beltane, Cerridwen gathered her ugly, hideous son and put him right by the cauldron, ready to receive those 3 drops. And the old man, well, he was tired after a year of stirring. And Cerridwen, well, she was tired too, after a year of gathering and preparing. And Avagdhi, well, he just didn't care. So what happened was Cerridwen fell asleep, and the old man fell asleep, and Avagdhi just sat around lounging, gazing into space. But Gwion Bark, Gwion knew he could not let anybody down. So he took over stirring the cauldron, and he rushed out to gather more twigs. And he fed the fire, because this was the last day, the most important day, when it all had to come together. And he rushed in, and he threw on more kindling to the fire and grabbed a huge wooden paddle. But the cauldron was too hot, and the potion was boiling and boiling and boiling, and then 3 drops, 3 drops flew from the cauldron and landed, ouch, on Gwyon's thumb. And he sucked them off. Yes, you would. And suddenly, his little mind was blown open. He could see everything. All that had been, all that was, and all that would ever be. And in that instant, when he gained all knowledge and all potential of the universe in a small Gwion Bark's body, he could see what was going to happen. He could see that Cerridwen was going to kill him for stealing her son's future. And Cerridwen's eyes snapped open. And she looked at Gwion Bark, and she knew. And he knew that she knew, and so he ran. He ran out of that cottage as fast as his little Gwion Bark's legs would carry him. And with his newfound wisdom, he knew he had to run faster and faster and faster, and he knew somehow he had to change into something other to get away from Cerridwen. And so he fell to the ground. And as he fell, his limbs seemed to change. Suddenly he was on all fours, and his Gwion Bark feet disappeared to be replaced with long, strong legs with long, thin feet. And from his head sprouted 2 long ears. And Gwion was a hare. So he ran as fast as a hare could run. And in glee, he looked behind him. He looked behind him thinking, oh, I've outwitted that witch. But oh no, Cerridwen, the one who provided the wisdom, well, she was a shapeshifter. So she turned herself into a greyhound bitch. She was going to rip his throat out. And fast as Gwion ran, she ran faster, chasing him towards the river. I've got you now, Gwion Bark. But as he neared the river, something in his brain, he didn't know how, but he knew. He jumped towards the river, and as he jumped, his fur fell away. And the hare's legs shrank into his body, and his ears disappeared, and splash into the river. He splashed as a sleek, shining salmon. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. He shot through the water. But Cerridwen transformed herself into an otter. And she too dived into the river. And she was faster than that salmon. And suddenly she was there, about to sink her fangs into that salmon's tail and rip it off. When Gwion Bark, and he didn't know how he knew, but he knew, he leapt with all his salmon strength up, out of the water. And behind him with all its strength, the otter went up. And just as it was about to pull him back into the water, Gwion felt a lightness about his body. And all around him glittered as scales fell, leaving a trail of sparkles as he rose up and up, feathers sprouting out of his newly bare skin. Wings formed, and then a beak, and then Gwion, although he didn't know how he knew, he had turned himself into a sparrow. And Cerridwen was enraged. and she gnashed her otter's teeth, and she threw off her otter's fur and sprouted feathers and wings and a beak of her own. And she became the sparrow hawk, faster and more deadly than any small sparrow. What was Gwion to do? He didn't know, so he flew as fast as his little wings could manage until he looked back and saw the sparrow hawk was about to grasp him in her cruel talons. And then suddenly, just beyond, he spied a farmyard, and there lay a huge pile of corn, ready and waiting to be sown for the coming season. So Gwion, in utter surrender, he let everything go. And he fell, and he fell, and he fell as a single grain of corn, and landed right on top of that pile. It was still, utterly peaceful. The sun warmed him. There were farmyard noises in the distance. Pigs oinking, sheep baaing, other birds he could hear tweeting. Oh, peace, peace, peace. But, what? Cerridwen, wise, shape-shifting Cerridwen, had turned herself into a barnyard hen who set to pecking at that corn. And she pecked, and she scratched, and she pecked, and she scratched, and she ate and ate and ate. She didn't care how full she got because she was going to eat that Gwion bark if it meant eating every single grain in that pile. And that's what she did. Goodbye, Gwion bark. She'd eaten him. He was dead. She'd had her revenge for stealing her son's gift. It was done. So she turned herself back into her human form and she just returned to her cottage. Meanwhile, inside her, all was warm and dark and gurgling. And Gwion bark, he lived on. And Gwion bark, he cracked open. And he found himself in warmth and in water and in nourishment. Was he in the ocean? Had he died? Was he in heaven? He didn't know. And so yet again, he shut off his mind and he surrendered. And very soon, Cerridwen realised what had happened. She was pregnant. What had she done? And so for 9 months, she had to wait till she could kill that little shit Gwion bark. 9 agonisingly long months, plotting and planning what she would do. Would she drown him in the lake? Would she boil him in the cauldron? Would she simply leave him in the forest for the wolves to devour? And then one day something quickened and Gwion bark came back to himself. He was being squeezed and folded and torn seemingly limb from limb. Such was the pressure and the pain. And he was screaming, but it didn't seem to come from him, and yet it did. And then the pain stopped and was replaced by light and cold and soft hands, raising him up, and large tear-filled eyes gazing at him, not with hatred, but with a mother's love. This baby, he was radiant, more beautiful than anything Cerridwen had ever seen. And in that moment, she knew she could not kill him. But to keep him was impossible too. So Cerridwen, the goddess, for that is what she had to be in that moment, wrapped this baby in sheep's wool and then oilskins, and then laid him in a coracle. Nature, fate, would have to decide what happened to this child with the radiant brow. She offered him to the river, and the river offered him to the sea. And from there, he travelled across the oceans of the world, remaining wrapped in his oilskins between worlds, between life and death, waiting, waiting, waiting. And now some say he travelled upon the waters for 9 days. Some say 9 weeks, 9 months. Some say it was 9 decades. Well, I don't know how long it was, but I do know this. One day, that coracle, it arrived back in the river where he had been cast out. And it was here that Elphin, a feckless, luckless, good-for-nothing son of a local bard, who was hardly any better than Avagthi had been. Well, he spotted this boat and the bundle in it. My luck has turned, thought Elphin. What have we here? Surely it must be treasure. And I will take it back to my father to prove that I am not as stupid and as useless as he deems me. And so Elphin, he opened that salt-encrusted oilskin, and instead of treasure, there lay a baby. The baby. A baby? What am I going to do with a baby? At which this baby sat up and spoke. I was born Gwion Bark. And then I died. And I died when I ran on the earth. And I died when I'd swum in the water. And I died when I flew up into the air. And I finally died as the fiery potential of the harvest. Only then I was born once more. I was born with all of the knowledge of the universe contained within my radiant brow. And that is who I am now, Taliesin of the radiant brow. And I'm the greatest of all the bards that ever was, is now, and will ever be. And if you agree to be my father, Elphin, you too will find histories kind to you. You will find your place as one of the greatest men that ever was. And I, Taliesin, will be your treasure. From my trails and trials and floating in death, I have been reborn. And do you know? This is exactly what happened. Elphin gained great acclaim at having a son who indeed was the greatest bard of all time. And they went on to have many adventures together because Taliesin could use his words and his wit and his wisdom to get them out of any situation. But all those tales will have to wait for another day. But for now, all we need to remember is this. At Beltane, when the fires of the coming season light our way, when summer starts to push at the door, we remember that just like Gwion, who became Taliesin, out of our trials and seeming moments of death will come the greatest potential for bounty and abundance in our lives. And that is the end, and I wish you Beltane blessings. May your fires be bright. May your life be abundant. Goodbye.